Good morning and welcome to the International Seminar Cities 2050, Planning Cities from the Territories, organized by the Ministry of Housing and Urbanism. We would like to offer a warm welcome to the Minister of Housing and Urbanism, Felipe Ward, and to our national and international experts who are here with us today, as well as to all of our speakers, moderators, panel members, and of course to all of our attendees who are watching our broadcast live on Emo TV from emo.com. We would also like to thank everyone who has sponsored this strategy for Cities 2050, led, of course, by Mivu, and also receiving technical support from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the National Council for Urban Development, and the Cities Observatory from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. We would also like to thank our important international agencies for their collaboration, including the United Nations Development Program, the Organization for Cooperation and Economic Development, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ICLAC, UN Habitat, and the Forum of Ministers and High-Level Authorities for Housing and Urban Development of Latin America, MINURB. This morning, we will have two panels with 3 renowned speakers, 6 eminent panel members as well, and then we will also have a conversation where we will hear a general overview of the main content we have talked about this morning. And we will also have a very important international architect with us. Now, to kick off this international seminar, we would like to invite the Minister of Housing and Urbanism, Felipe Ward, who will offer welcoming remarks and who will tell us a little bit about what Cities 2050 means. Welcome, Minister. Good morning, Barbara. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. I would like to begin my remarks by thanking everybody who has collaborated on Cities 2050, the long-term urban planning strategy that we will be talking about and analyzing at this international seminar today. I would like to thank the work of the National Council for Urban Development, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the UC Cities Observatory from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. I would also like to thank everyone who has helped organize this event, including the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ICLAC, UN Habitat, and the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. I would also like to reach out to the representatives and delegates of the countries belonging to the Forum of Ministers and High-Level Authorities for Housing and Urban Development of Latin America and the Caribbean, MINURB, which is the agency that Chile is currently presiding over. We are chairing for 2021-2022, and I want to thank the Minister of Urban Development and Housing of Ecuador, Dario Herrera, who is here as the vice chair of that forum, and we are honored to have him here at the seminar. I would also like to especially thank all of the mayors and presidential delegates and regional governors and representatives of civil society, centers for study, and everyone who is here with us today following this broadcast, which we hope will be an opportunity for reflection with distinguished national and international experts to talk about the challenges facing cities at a moment shaped by the pandemic and by climate change. And we are aiming for integrated urban planning with an eye to 2050. I would also like to point out some statistics about why it's so important to think about cities now. And we hope that this will help us think about the cities we want tomorrow. According to UN Habitat, since 2007, more than half of the global population is living in cities, and it's expected to rise to 60% by 2030. In the case of Chile, we have almost 90% of residents living in urban hubs. More than 65% are in metropolitan areas with more than 250,000 inhabitants. As a result of that, we can deduct that the impact of the health crisis brought on by the spread of COVID-19 is going to be most devastating in urban areas that are densely populated. We can also say that cities are only covering 3% of the planet's surface area, but they account for 75% of carbon emissions, and they consume between 60 to 80% of power and energy. In conclusion, the decisions that we make around cities are going to affect the rest of our territories, and that's why they are so vital to building our future. In early 2020, the coronavirus pandemic arrived, causing not just the most complex health crisis Chile has seen in the past 100 years, but also having a major impact on our economy. And as a result of that, We've seen an impact on income and employment for millions of families, especially the most vulnerable sectors of our population and the middle classes. The pandemic has also revealed urgent problems that are long-standing, like overcrowding and lack of urban facilities and equipment. And we've also seen visibility given to new phenomena around access to housing, such as demographic changes and people's preferences to live in more central locations. In terms of policy, we need greater citizen participation and involvement in building out the territory in which we live. For that reason, we think it's essential to create a public policy whose main objective is to think about cities as an engine for decentralization and strengthening regionalization across the country. In May 2021, in Chile, we had the first elections for regional governors, and that was an unprecedented opportunity, a chance to define new ways to collaborate and relate to each other and relate between the local and central authorities with a new approach on urban planning from the territories themselves to achieve greater investment in key areas such as transportation, housing, environment, and public works. This is a unique moment in time for us to improve in the medium and long term. We believe that it will be essential to include everyone in this Cities 2050 initiative with a sense of urgency to have more inclusive, human-oriented, and sustainable cities, because social integration is the solution so that cities become spaces to deliver equal opportunities to all of the residents in our country. Social integration is the development of urban public policy so that everyone can live in better conditions. So what is Cities 2050? That's the question that sparked this international seminar. Cities 2050 is a long-term urban planning strategy that aims to have integrated, equitable, sustainable, and resilient cities for the next 30 years, and which has concrete tools. We have a platform of urban development indicators for Cities 2050. We also call them city indicators, and it helps us track the progress made by collecting data about new urban indicators to put together city plans. A city plan can serve as a strategic plan and a roadmap projected into the future. And it starts with defining a shared vision of what we want from our cities. And that requires regional governors, authorities, municipalities, communities, and other relevant stakeholders to be involved. And we have to define and prioritize the projects that we want so that they can be correctly implemented. I want to take advantage of this moment to give you the good news that we have the first City Plan 2050, which will be implemented in Puerto Montt in the Los Lagos region. In fact, the regional governor, Patricio Vallapin, is also going to be participating in the seminar today. And we have the support from our ministry and from UNDP, from the World Bank, and also financial support from the Undersecretary for Regional Development. We're hoping to start developing this plan in the upcoming weeks. The system that contains these city indicators that we talked about will feed into this first city plan. And we've been able to put it together thanks to the UC Cities Observatory and the Center for City Studies and Territories from the Ministry of Housing and Urbanism. And it will become the first digital tool that allows us to compare indicators. Some of them are new, some are already existing, and we'll also be able to identify gaps and monitor the progress made in our cities nationwide. This platform has 39 indicators divided into 4 dimensions. We have social and urban integration, equity, security and resilience, and economic development. The data will be publicly available and it will be transparent, and it's actually available already right now at www.minvu.cl. We want to bring people closer to information about the places where they live, and it will serve as valuable input for decision-making, targeting plans and programs and financing, and of course, investment. Now, why Cities 2050? Why are we thinking of a 30-year planning timeline? Cities are going to be around for a long time, and we want to have city plans that go beyond just the short and medium term. We need to apply plans already. What we're facing in the contemporary world with the pandemic, with climate change, with accelerated economic changes, we've seen the emergence of latent problems that have been ailing our country for years. And the urgency to resolve them has made it even more pressing to intervene in our cities to achieve more effective and equitable provision of public services. In short, we want to advance toward overcoming the major urban challenges, and that requires coming up with roadmaps toward greener cities, more resilient, inclusive, sustainable, and competitive cities. The problems of the future do not belong to the future. They need to be addressed now in our present. And this is very important. They need to be addressed with a sense of urgency. It's also very important to mention that the cities have to be tied to policy. We need to have policies that have continuity. So our efforts have been around strengthening the interinstitutional and multi-sectoral nature of this initiative. In turn, this 2050 strategy is aligned with lots of different international agendas and agreements, creating additional opportunities to actively incorporate these into our national agenda. Cities 2050 is an initiative that's going to help us work together to guarantee consensus around urban development in Chile, and it's going to help us advance toward the kinds of cities we want to build a shared vision of our future and to get closer to the objectives on which cities are founded, to be places where everyone can develop their maximum capabilities, feel safe and protected, take advantage of the opportunities that urban hubs have to offer. We firmly believe that this strategy is going to help us address the main challenges in housing, cities, and territories around the country. We hope that in the near future, it will also do the same for Latin America and the rest of the world. Thank you so much, and we hope you have a great seminar. Thank you so much, Minister. It's so interesting to hear, and we're also appreciative that you've helped us organize this encounter. We're sure everyone will be interested. We now want to hear greetings from the Executive Director of the UN Human Settlements Program, UN Habitat, Ms. Maimuna Mode.
Honorable Felipe Ward, Minister of Housing and Urban Development of Chile and President of Minerva, Excellencies Ministers, local government representatives, and urban development practitioners, distinguished guests, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. Buenos dias. It is a great pleasure for me to speak at this important event convened by the Honorable Minister Felipe Ward, whom I warmly greet to discuss about Cities 2050 and the importance to plan for the territories with a long-term perspective. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as you might be aware, more than half of us live in cities. It's expected that by 2050, two-thirds of all humanity, 6.5 billion people, will be living in urban areas, representing bigger challenges to local governments, to citizens, to sustainability and inclusion. We come from a complex year in which the persistent pandemic has exposed our society to new and chronic challenges, starting from a health crisis and developing rapidly into social and economic crisis of unprecedented scale, together with the climate change challenge in our cities and communities. This 2022 is a year of opportunity to build back better and greener, and today's discussion is important since it is without doubt that an effective implementation of the new urban agenda for more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities and human settlements will make the difference in the social economic recovery strategy around the world. I would like to stress on four important aspects. First, how we can redesign our cities for sustainable recovery. There are areas where we must look deeply to achieve green recovery. Second, how we can address poverty, so to reduce the gap between the rich and poor. Third, How can we introduce new economic and recovery model? And fourth, the importance of governance and innovation systems. Sustainable development cannot be achieved without significantly transforming the way we plan, build, and manage our urban spaces. Finally, I invite you to follow up on the development of the high-level meeting of the General Assembly, which will be held on April 28th in New York, where member states will assess and discuss progress made in the implementation of the new urban agenda. Please also take part in the 11th session of World Urban Forum in Katowice, Poland in June, the premier global conference on sustainable urban development convened by UN Habitat every 2 years. These events will be strategic to gain support and energize collective actions to leave no one and no place behind. I wish all of you fruitful discussion. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
We would like to thank Maimuna Mood for her remarks, and we would like to invite everybody who's connected to this broadcast of the International Seminar Cities 2050, Planning Cities from the Territory, to join us for this first panel, which is about global challenges for cities looking to 2050 and the role of planning. The goal of this panel is to help us reflect about the importance of integrated urban planning with a strategic vision and a long-term vision. And all of these global challenges that we've seen with cities going toward 2050, both nationally and internationally, are going to be addressed at this panel. So to begin, we would like to welcome Mr. Samet Waba, who will be speaking about a very interesting topic. He's the Global Director for the World Bank's Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience, and Land Global Practice. He also has a doctoral and master's degree from the University of Harvard in urban planning and has ample experience in territorial and geospatial development. Samet, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to Minister Felipe Ward, the Minister of Housing and Urban Development, for leading this seminar and for the invitation to participate. Thanks also to the members of the National Council for Urban Development, and greetings to all, to the Chilean authorities, to the participants, to the speakers, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here and discuss with you briefly some thoughts about planning the post-pandemic city. Now, COVID-19 has had an unprecedented global threat to cities and communities everywhere around the world, with a very serious impact in terms of public health. We're talking 315 million cases and over 5.5 million deaths as of January 12. In particular, COVID has had a severe economic impact on cities. Now, this has been the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. There's been significant business closures. Actually, we could measure these. If you see the two images on the right, they're night lights in the city of Wuhan, the first taken January 19, the second February 4, and you can see the significant dimming in the night lights, which suggests business closures, but also there has been major job losses and livelihoods that have been impacted, small businesses, etc., predominantly in cities. There's been also a major impact on the informal sector workers around the world. That's anywhere between 1.6 to 2 billion workers with unstable incomes and lacking safety nets. The World Bank estimates that 100 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty in 2020, and this has been the first reversal in poverty alleviation in over 20 years. And lastly, cities have been hit really hard by a drop of city revenues, somewhere between 15 to 30% of forecasted loss in revenue because of the closures in economic activities, the reduction in tax collections, etc. Now, this has had impacts in terms of a disruption to service delivery, which, by the way, their costs in terms of essential services has increased because of these disruptions. and more importantly, severe cuts in capital investment plans. COVID has revealed serious inequalities also in cities and nations. I mean, these two images, the left-hand side, typical of slums and informal settlements in many cities around the developing world, places that lack the public space and the quality of housing and infrastructure to be able to support a social distancing. Places on the right-hand side, this is the city of Seoul in South Korea, which has fared very differently because the livable density there allows for people to socially distance. But it's not only the difference between the built environment in cities, there has been also serious inequalities between nations and between people in terms of access to vaccine. Now, in particular, slums and informal settlements have been very hard hit. 1 billion slum and informal settlement residents in developing countries, as I mentioned, are unable to socially distance. They live in overcrowded housing of poor conditions. The places where they live lack infrastructure services, especially water and sanitation. Transport is crowded, public space is lacking, hence contagion risk is increasing. We have measured this at the World Bank by modeling three-dimensionally cities, as you see on the right-hand side. The picture depicts Mumbai in three-dimensional form, and then when you distribute the density on the built space, the areas that are appearing in red in the bottom map suggest places where social distancing cannot happen in theory because the amount of built floor space per person is below what is needed to allow for a 2-meter social distancing. But also these places, slums and informal settlements, lack access to health services and have a large share of the population that works in the informal sector whose livelihoods have been affected by lockdowns. Now, there are the 1.6 to 2 billion informal sector workers. They cannot afford to stay at home. They cannot study from home. They cannot work from home. They need to go to work. And as you see from these images, there are very stark differences between livelihoods and contagion risk for peoples of different professions and different socioeconomic classes. And in fact, we know for a fact that poor people's mobility during lockdowns has not declined significantly, whereas the mobility of the highest income strata has declined significantly. Cities have been in the front line of combating this epidemic and have worked on 3 different fronts. The first is a citywide emergency interventions, testing, contact tracing, treating the poor and those whose health have been affected, but also running the city and operating key services despite all the disruptions. The second level of interventions are targeted interventions by cities to support the poor and the vulnerable, especially people who live in slums and informal settlements whose livelihood have been affected. And then the third dimension of work from cities have been the recovery planning, have been working to prepare the city for the new normal and for post-COVID recovery. Now we're going to delve in the coming few minutes on different dimensions of what the city in the new normal will be expected to look like. First, the future of work will be very different. In fact, there has been a tendency from pre-COVID of some level of remote work. And what happened with the pandemic is that this tendency has been significantly accelerated. So in pre-COVID, a survey from Ernst & Young and the Urban Land Institute suggested that in pre-COVID times, we were talking about maybe 20% of the workers, working remotely for about 20% of the time. We're talking in a post-pandemic world, anywhere between 40 to 60% of workers working at least 40% remotely. And therefore, the model of hybrid work is going to be increasing significantly. And with that model, there will be important implications on the demand for office space, which is likely to decrease going forward. Cities will also continue to thrive in the post-COVID era if they manage to adapt well from that perspective. Now, when we look at, as I mentioned, the distribution of work within any given city, there will be jobs that could be done from home. These are jobs, of the sort of, database entries, software developers, etc. Jobs that whose profile lends itself to being able to be done remotely with the right technology. On the other hand of the spectrum, there are jobs that cannot be done remotely. Lots of it are essential services within a city, whether we're talking about, restaurant workers, we're talking about meat packers, we're talking about baristas, we're talking about, nurses, we're talking about police, etc. These are essential jobs that have to continue to be done in person. And then in between is a range of jobs that could be developed along a hybrid model. Now, physical offices will need to adapt to be able to support this new configuration of work. And in this regard, the quality of urban spaces and the quality of amenities will be critical to meet the new demand. There is an expectation that there will be much more emphasis on building not only safer workplaces, but also better amenities that could attract people to work, more spaces for collaborative work, to maintain one of the main dimensions of being able to benefit from proximity, which is the knowledge spillovers, the agglomeration effect. So there will be an expectations that workplaces will adapt to avail more space per capita, more collaborative workplaces, and obviously definitely safer and more attractive amenities. Now, the real estate environment and market demand will also call for different solutions, more flexible, more creative solutions to utilize urban assets. So there'll be not just different demand for office space, an expectation of less demand, but an adjusted nature of that demand. There is an expectation that contracting, whether lease contracts, they'll be more flexible, customized, adaptable, and there will be also a need to think to adapt, office space that is vacating. We're talking in London about, empty office spaces being transformed into new affordable housing. Government in Korea is talking about, buying empty hotels and offices to convert them to public housing units, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the new built environment will also have a premium on this flexibility and adaptation. Now, in terms of the perception of urban density, we all know the benefits of living in cities, the benefits of urban density, which is access to jobs, access to high quality amenities, specialized services, the economies of scale, the agglomeration effect, and the increased productivity and innovation. That's the positive side of urbanization. And we also know the negative side of urbanization when it's not managed well. High contagion risk, but also pollution, congestion, and crime and violence, and lack of affordable housing. Now, what we know from the pandemic is that density is not to blame for the contagion and the spread, as in the beginning, some have been saying. We've seen when we've looked in China, at the World Bank, we've looked at Chinese cities, and you notice that the largest cities with the higher population density and the larger absolute population figures have had lower levels of infection than, if you will, the cities that range between 5 to 10,000 person per square kilometer, those medium-sized cities where there has been high rates of infection. So it's not about density, it's not about population size. We've also, looking at a city like New York, by ward, the Manhattan, which is the highest density ward, had much lower levels of cases than, let's say, wards like the Bronx or Queens. And we've also seen places that have equivalent population densities, Manhattan and Dharavi in Mumbai, with very different impacts. Again, because a place like Dharavi has much lower level built environment, not to mention the quality, but also much less built floor space per person, which would allow to safely maintain social distance, etc. Now, the expectation and what we're seeing from some of the cities around the world that are starting to plan for the post-COVID recovery is for a mixed land use type of an environment with high density, but the livable type of densities would be key to making cities both sustainable and livable, but also with resilience to shocks. So we've been hearing about the 15-minute city. Paris has been a proponent. City of Milan is also talking about a 15-minute city with an attempt to bring, if you will, the day-to-day necessities within a 15-minute commute from home. These are, places to shop, to work, education facilities, schools, open spaces, etc. Melbourne adapted the concept towards a 20-minute city. Now, there are, of course, advantages to bringing day-to-day activities within proximity to where one lives. It reduces commuting time. It creates a built environment that's much more diversified and much more interesting. But of course, we have to remember that the main attraction of cities is their agglomeration effect. And that is key to expanding access to jobs and proximity to people, to innovation and to ideas. And therefore, a strict bringing together of everything at the neighborhood level could risk also creating a spatial segregation and devoiding cities of their major attribute, which is expanding people's access to opportunities. Now, we expect also to see spatial planning getting strengthened and especially integrated at metropolitan level to be able to plan spatially across jurisdictions, so a group of municipalities coming together, and across sectors. We expect to see, infrastructure standards getting revisited, and the upgrading of areas that are lacking in infrastructure, slums and informal settlements, places that could be potential places of potential hazard, abattoirs, wet markets, live animal markets, etc. Regulations about their siting, about their operational safety, much more attention to public space, whether in terms of design parameters, sidewalk, open spaces, more of them, better distribution of these. Thinking about occupancy and crowding threshold in public places, in gathering places, and also of the peri-urban areas and their planning and linkages. There will be, of course, an important rethink of mobility that is happening, congested public transit systems being adapted for safety, and then much more rethinking about the amount of real estate that the car is utilizing and the efficiency of utilization of this real estate. We've seen cities around the world taking space away from cars and converting it into sidewalks, into expansion of pedestrian areas, into bicycle lanes. I mean, the city of Auckland is widening sidewalks. The city of Bogota is, have implemented, close to 80 some kilometers of emergency bike lanes, and many other cities have expanded non-motorized, what you call active mobility, non-motorized vehicles, but also working on making public transportation safer, much more sustainable, are all critical dimensions of how cities are rethinking mobility to make it safer, but also much better in terms of contribution to climate mitigation, because active mobility clearly reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and also public transportation. So as one thinks about the amount of space that a car uses, I mean, it takes, in parking, it takes a good 10 square meters of space. When the car is moving, to buffer for space before the car, after the car for safety, we're talking about 25 square meters of real estate that the car is using, and how one could displace that and put much more efficient use of that real estate in sidewalks and pedestrian areas, but also in cycling lanes. Another important dimension in cities will be to strengthen their emergency preparedness and response capacity. So thinking about facilities like the emergency operation centers, thinking about how to enhance the city's ability to do risk assessment, crisis management, and preparedness, and to coordinate between the different entities at the public sector, but also to coordinate between jurisdictions within a metropolitan area or at regional level. At the same time, there'll be an important emphasis on enhancing government preparedness and their capacity to deal with pandemics by taking into consideration the medium to long-term measures that are needed to strengthen health systems and to strengthen emergency management. Part of that will require also cities to look at how do they strengthen and diversify their municipal finances, including own source revenues, etc., because of the shocks that cities have faced in a period of COVID to be able to maintain services. And then lastly, developing contingency plans for human resources and service delivery and other essential functions. Cities will also be rethinking their supply chains for self-sufficiency. Cities that are dependent on, logistics from faraway places with the disruptions in trade, with the disruption in movement, have been faced with shocks, and therefore there will be, more and more cities thinking about having, agile operating models, bringing manufacturing closer to consumption points, thinking about urban agriculture and the like. In terms of investment, we expect that obviously digital infrastructure, digital solutions will be invested in significantly. I mean, improvement in internet bandwidth, enabling access, especially in underserved areas, but also thinking about a range of issues to help strengthen, protect this digital infrastructure and improve also logistics so that one can facilitate the functioning of the city and access to services. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, cities will be needing to tackle those inequities that have been laid bare by COVID-19. Places such as slums, such as informal settlements, are not only places where people, have very poor living conditions, lack of access to services, but they've proven also to be major places of contagion and of health risk. So therefore, it would be really critical for cities to not only invest in slum upgrading, but also concurrently to invest in housing construction and affordable housing policies, subsidies, and the like, so that you can enable people to access affordable housing and therefore prevent further demand on slum and further slum formation. So a combination of investment in slum upgrading and in housing. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Same. What you've presented is very interesting. We're hearing about problems that have been going on for a long time. But what's even more interesting is the possibility to see that we have the chance to solve these problems, and that's what Cities 2050 is here for. We now want to welcome the moderator of our first panel and all of the panel members who are going to be with us. I'm going to begin with Pablo Allard, who will be moderating our panel. He's the Dean of Faculty of Architecture and Art of the University of Development. He's also a council member of the National Council for Urban Development and an architect with a master's degree in architecture from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. Pablo, welcome. How are you doing today? Welcome. Thank you to the minister and to everyone who is here with us today at this important Cities 2050 seminar. I am so honored to be here moderating this panel. So I want to take this moment to introduce our panel members. We have Dario Herrera, who's a Minister of Urban Development and Housing in Ecuador, and his mandate has been shaped by implementing the National Habitat and Housing Plan to help reactivate the economy in his country, Ecuador. Welcome, Dario. How are you? Thank you, Barbara. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Very grateful for Felipe Ward's invitation. The Minister of Housing and the chair of Minorbe right now. We're very happy to be here and participate. We're certain you will. And we also welcome Tatiana Gallego, who's the Chief Housing and Urban Development Division of the Climate Change and Sustainability Department at the Inter-American Development Bank. She has a master's and doctoral degree from Imperial College London in environmental engineering and a postgrad in policy studies for the School of African and Oriental Studies. Tatiana, welcome. Good morning, Barbara, and thank you to Minister Herrera and Pablo and Minister Ward and all of the other panel members. And we also have Jose Luis Samaniego, who's the Chief of the Division for Sustainable Development and Human Settlements of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. He's an economist and a lead fellow in international policy. Jose Luis, welcome. Thank you so much, Barbara. Again, thank you for the opportunity. I want to send my greetings to the chair of Minorbe, Minister Ward, as well, on behalf of Chile, and I would like to thank our moderator and panel members for joining me. I'm so grateful to be here at this opportunity for Cities 2050. We've now introduced everyone, so Pablo, we are ready to go. The floor is yours. Thank you so much, Barbara. How exciting to hear the start of this conversation with the presentation from Same Wapa. I think we heard a really important contribution about many of the aspects and challenges that we're facing in our cities. And it's exciting to already be entering into the first quarter of the 21st century. A lot of times when we talk about the 21st century, we think about it as something out into the future, but we're already there. We're getting to the first quarter of the 21st century, and we're still thinking about what solutions we might find. We're facing great uncertainty in terms of the global pandemic, but we're also before great opportunities. And I think that's what we should underscore in this panel and in this conversation. And in particular, we want to think about the prospects for the best futures possible for our cities with an eye to 2050. What is happening with our long-term vision? How can we drive or steer or channel these demands and opportunities and challenges in the right direction to have better cities by the mid-century? And that's why we have this panel. We've got about 40 minutes to discuss. And I would like to first pose a broad question for each one of our panel members, and then we're going to have a more open conversation. So I would like to begin with Tatiana. Tatiana combines urban affairs with climate change and cultural matters. And in your experience at the IDV, Tatiana, I know we've heard about some of these challenges from Same, but what do you think the main challenges are that are facing cities with an eye to 2050 beyond climate change and the pandemic and maybe migration and social demands? And how can integrated urban planning, that means intersectoral, multi-level planning with integration between spaces and territories and cities, and a long-term vision, how can that help us address these challenges? So Tatiana, welcome. I'm excited to hear your vision. On the contrary, thanks to you, I'm excited to reflect about the comments we've heard from Minister Ward and Maimuna and Same. As we've heard throughout Latin America and the Caribbean and the rest of the world, we are facing crises, especially the health crisis, the COVID health crisis, and the imminent climate change crisis, which has been building for some time now. But I think both have made clear that there are economic, social, and environmental gaps that have been around for quite some time. So on the one hand, on the territorial side, the pandemic has shown concerning differences in transmission patterns. If we think historically, the way that emerging diseases have behaved in the past 50 years, they've multiplied 4 times. And that is in large part due to ineffective development resulting from fragmented habitats, contamination, intensive usage of resources, and growing or expansive usage of land. These are all topics about which we must reflect in our planning exercises. And on the other side, we're seeing pressures in the urban environment, where we have urbanization happening, which has continued to accelerate the world over, especially in our region. We're seeing land usage following unsustainable patterns, urban sprawl. In fact, we have recent studies that shows that it has doubled in 20 years. So we can see different aspects in failings in the real estate market, but also inefficient suburbanization processes that has led to this persistent socio-spatial segregation. Now, of course, the pandemic, having said that, as you said, Pablo, the pandemic has really brought in potential for a lot of changes that we maybe didn't think about before. Same spoke obviously about remote work for people who can, remote learning for people who can, remote education. And we can potentially see a change in the models for our cities, reducing the amount of space you might have to commute or travel, reducing displacement, changing the way we live in our neighborhoods. But I want to refer to that also in a minute from now. You said that planning, integrated planning, is central. And I think it's important to think about this in the context of Cities 2050 at the urban level, but also to see it as an opportunity to think at the broader territorial level. In urban terms, I think there's probably 3 areas where I think we have opportunities. And it's important to do capacity building for our cities in planning and management. So first, we need to have better coordination between economic planning, spatial planning, and infrastructure planning, fostering polycentrism, more diverse usage of land, and also distribution of opportunities and jobs. So if we think about the most vulnerable groups in our communities, it's oftentimes people who have to commute the farthest in the most precarious conditions. We need to think about having multiple hubs in the city and transform our neighborhoods into sort of social units or economic units that function at the human scale. We've kind of lost sight of that. Our cities have grown so much that we've lost sight of that. I also think, second, there's an opportunity for greater integration between efficient land use policy and habitat and housing policy. We can use indicators. We've spoken about overcrowding before. We know that there's a lot of density. We can use indicators about green spaces and population density. This is so important, especially in the pandemic. But we can also think about our public transportation systems. We can think about having systems oriented toward transit. And here I'm going to put on my hat, as you said, about climate change. The third point, I think we are before an extraordinary opportunity for urban planning to incorporate decarbonization and climate change adaptation objectives. What happens so often is that people who are living in informal settlements are living in precarious areas. We need to bring them into the fold. And we're working very closely with Minvu and working at a broader level. I think there's a lot of potential. And very briefly, because I know that the time is short, at the territorial level, there's 3 things that I think are really important. And I think they all stack up with what I've been talking about. One, making sure that we have rural and urban ties, that we have instruments that enable conservation of natural capital in order to strengthen our ability to adapt. This can be done through, for example, ecosystem expenditure. And second, I think that we have to think about developing cities, again, at the human level, at the human scale. We have to think about competitiveness and capacity. And we have to think about networks and corridors that will create functional common economic development. This is going to help our smallest cities be in a situation where they're not losing population to the bigger cities, which are becoming these tremendous urban hubs. And third, where we do have those tremendous urban hubs, we really have to think about metropolitan governance. We have to think about having institutionality and frameworks that are going to allow us to better manage services and land markets and public property. And there I am going to pause. I know I went over the amount of time I was supposed to take. Thank you so much, Pablo. No, thank you, Tatiana. I think your comments are really relevant, especially about finding this balance. We should focus not only on urban planning within urban hubs, but also the impact on the environment and on the broader territories and smaller towns as well. Because at the end of the day, we have to think about a network of human settlements that work in an ecosystem together. And another topic that's really important, and I would like to bring this up, is conservation of natural capital, which is a relevant value. It's very important when it comes to planning dimensions in the territory. And I think it can really help us complete some of our objectives around climate change. So thank you, Tatiana, for those opening remarks. And I hope we can zoom in a little closer on some of those topics later on. Jose Luis, for you, from that same standpoint, thinking about the fact that, as Tatiana said, we have to strike a balance between economic and spatial and infrastructure planning. What do you think are some of the barriers that are limiting the adoption of an integrated planning approach in cities? And what changes do we have to implement or already being implemented in the national agenda for these cities to overcome these barriers and to eventually be able to effectively achieve the planning and implementation of public policy that we're looking for in these territories that is more integrated and more long-term? Uh, our keynote speaker and Tatiana have brought up a lot for us to think about in this diagnosis. But specifically to your question, a lot of efforts have been made on the international agenda to have more humane planning with fewer externalities in our cities. And of course, the new urban agenda is very important, and it is part of the 2030 agenda, where for the first time, we're seeing cities as a relevant stakeholder. They are being recognized in development strategies with SDG 11. And we're kind of setting service quality as our North Star. But let me underscore another dimension that I think doesn't get enough attention, but Tatiana also touched on it. And I think it could help change the way we do planning and the way we integrate planning and the way we set targets for human development. At this point in time, a lot of effort has been made to incorporate cities into global dialogues. We're seeing that in the General Assembly. We're seeing that in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we're trying to get stakeholders involved, including cities. But if we think about the nationally determined contributions, there can be a really big impact there, and it's still not very visible. The nationally determined contributions, like Chile has, are, well, they've actually kind of already become like a national carbon budget, and they're about to become sectoral carbon budgets. So we need to take a step further to set territorial carbon targets that are going to combine the allocations or the emission entitlements per sector, like transportation or energy or construction, and express them in territorial terms. So yes, there is a national dimension, but there also should be a territorial dimension. And I want to offer an extreme parallel here. Disorderly and unplanned development can even be good for the GDP. The GDP encourages it because you've got to run to catch up with construction, with services. There's a very clearly established accumulation mechanism involved in disorderly planning, and that's reflected in GDP, and that can be reflected in growth, which is one of our shared objectives. But you have to, if you combine carbon budgets or territorial and sectoral carbon budgets with growth, then you have to have an orderly system, because not any development style is going to be compatible with carbon budgets or the adaptation targets that Tatiana spoke about. So the problem with our metrics can be mitigated once you start to combine climate goals with human development goals and with the instruments that are being introduced in our economies. Adaptation goals and decarbonization goals as well. I also want to offer a couple of remarks on a more global scale. Chile, like the rest of Latin America, is facing a tremendous demographic transition, which at one point in time was called the demographic bonus. We hope that it will continue to be a bonus rather than a burden, but it's completely unstoppable. It's here to stay. So we are going to be emerging from a demographic transition with cities where we have a large portion of our population, and the solutions have to be national. We're going to face aging populations, and the infrastructure that was built in the 20th century may not be entirely functional. That 15 or 20-minute city we talk about is not just for comfort, it has to be matched in our demographic structure. An elderly person may not be able to cross an avenue as it is right now, and therefore you're creating neighborhood segregation simply due to the infrastructure we have. It can be difficult for elderly people to get onto public transportation if they're not properly organized, or if they don't have proper regulations and rules to allow access for everyone to these services. So I would say, if we're thinking about the North Stars that should guide our development, we have to think about localizing international instruments, like we can think about the Paris Accords and the nationally determined contributions and the climate agenda to guide us. And another guiding star is to add another metric, which is the quality of public services, because that is going to affect local economies and can also help you socially integrate everyone. If we think about the case of Chile, just think about in the pandemic, as in many other cities throughout Latin America, the rate of driving went up and the usage of public transportation down. And that's a tsunami that's practically unstoppable. It's not viable to have a city where the rate of driving is as high as some of the developed countries, and the traffic is going to jeopardize public services. So we should keep this as our guiding star, our North Star, the quality of public services that is going to enable you to attend the 3 pillars of the 2030 agenda and hopefully allow these cities to become more humane, more livable, and using other metrics that help us measure how close we're getting to that paradigm. Jose Luis, those comments were really salient, especially that need to territorialize our pledges, especially in countries or territories that can be so complex, like Chile. We've got what we call so-called sacrifice zones. We have so much of our GDP coming from mining in Chile, and it has a tremendous impact in the mining towns and mining territories. And those benefits may not reach the communities. Those benefits are actually felt in the big cities, like in Santiago. And as you've pointed out, it's about organizing it. It's about getting it into shape to have growth that goes hand in hand with resolving our pledges to reduce emissions at the territory level, the national and sectoral level as well. I think that's really clear. We hear a lot that Chile is one of the countries in our region that has achieved the most in reducing emissions, but in per capita, we still continue to be one of the biggest emitters because we don't have a very big population. So we may have achieved some, but we're still producing a lot of emissions. And the other important point that you brought up is this topic about a new metric. And Tatiana touched on that as well. If we think about human scale neighborhoods, equity of services, accessibility to public services, which is a very important part of inequality. And as you've said, especially if we're facing an aging population, cities in Latin America have really been tailored and adapted, especially as they've grown in informal ways. We know that sometimes there can be a staircase or a building that is just difficult to access for some people. And as you said, it's important to measure not just the quality of public services, but also accessibility to those services, the coverage, the proximity. I don't know if we can get to that 15-minute paradigm, but hopefully a 20 or 30-minute paradigm and not 2 to 3 hours, as we see in so many cities, so people can access their jobs and work and services. And I also want to highlight what Minister Ward said about this Cities 2050 initiative. It's designed around an indicator that is being developed by the Cities Observatory from UC and the Center for Studies from the Ministry of Housing, which is precisely meant to verify in advance and afterwards if we are effectively closing those accessibility and quality gaps when it comes to public services. It is undoubtedly an enormous challenge. Of course, it's an even bigger challenge for Minister Dario Herrera from Ecuador, who is here with us. I had a professor who used to say something that I always repeat: planning is human, implementing is divine. And undoubtedly, when you have the authority and you have the mandate to go from plans to investment to public policy, undeniably, it requires the capacity to build consensus and dialogue and the technical know-how and participation to lend legitimacy from the territories. That's all very key. So, Minister Herrera, I wanted to ask you about your experience and also keep in mind that we have a lot to share with the world. Latin America is one of the regions with the highest rates of urbanization in the world. We've already had the big migration from the countryside to the city, but as Tatiana mentioned, our cities are still growing. They're still sprawling. Some Latin American cities have seen some success and they've been recognized, like the urban renewal of Neighborhood 31 in Buenos Aires and Medellin as well, which is a long-standing process. And we can think about public transportation in Quito as well, which is an example of public transportation that is something we haven't been able to achieve in Chile, a bus corridor in a heritage site city. It's a UNESCO heritage site without affecting the urban image. I think that's quite striking. And we see other examples as well. So, from your experience in Ecuador, thinking about post new agenda, what can we take away from best practices in Latin America that we could implement in a post COVID world? What can Latin America offer to the rest of the world and the Caribbean? What can we offer to the rest of the world and to other cities that are facing these challenges? Thank you, Pablo, for this opportunity. I would like to start by sharing that I agree with the remarks made by Jose Luis and Tatiana. I 100% support their remarks, and I even share some of their viewpoints. And I'm going to bring them up in response to your question. But first, I would like to send warm greetings on behalf of our president, Guillermo Lasso Mendoza, and from our ministry. We are so pleased to be participating in this forum, Cities 2050, the international seminar. I'm thankful to Felipe for the invitation, and I am always willing to collaborate on these types of seminars. I also want to thank the National Council for Urban Development and the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, ICLAC, UN Habitat, everybody who's made this possible. I think it's very important to think about cities in the medium and long term. And our experts here today analyzing the future of our urban hubs and the potential to plan territories, I think is an incredible opportunity to share and come up with ideas and solutions that could eventually become public policy to confront these challenges in sustainable urban development. In response to your question and those success stories that Pablo touched on, I am familiar with some cases. I haven't had the pleasure necessarily to experience all of them myself, but as a user in a city, or even as a visitor or a guest from the private sector focusing on real estate development, I think that for the first time, since 7 months now, things are starting to change. There are certainly some variables that can make it more complex. You may notice them or not notice them as a public servant. But having said that, I think the examples we heard about call on us to think more carefully and more deeply around the four dimensions of the new urban agenda: social sustainability, economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and of course, spatial sustainability, which is so impactful. We all recognize that our planet is becoming more and more urban, especially in Latin America. I agree with you that settlements and migration to the big cities has already happened. Those are problems that we're facing now. And we have to confront the challenges of urbanization. I agree with Tatiana around intelligent land use. We also can imagine that these challenges can be great opportunities because urbanization can mean economic growth. But as Jose Luis said, we have to add to that environmental awareness and make sure that we're developing for our citizens. So these actions are aimed to help us have public policy to advance towards sustainable cities, making them more equitable and sustainable, and improving quality of life for inhabitants. But what's really important is a holistic approach and that spatial sustainability. So I want to focus on replicating some success stories. There's two aspects that I think I want to highlight of what you've talked about. Number one is urban development with planned communities in compact poly-center cities that allow access to services and facilities, and these corridors that Jose Luis and Tatiana talked about in order to have social integration. That's a really important point for me, social and economic integration. Another point that we really want to replicate and we focus on a lot is real solutions to create new transportation systems that are going to improve the speed of transportation around cities, both that we have now and in the future cities we're going to build in Latin America. And if we think about Medellin, for example, there's been some architecture with a social integration approach, a network of public spaces and cable metro as well to provide transportation and access to new stations and places that can be sort of like intermodal hubs and create public spaces in far-flung neighborhoods. So that's one good example of points of encounter. We have to think about integrating public spaces to improve mobility and create spaces for meeting, for encounter. We can think about reaching the broadest swaths of the population. As the government here in Ecuador, what really matters to us, we know that 5 years ago, we came up with this new urban agenda. So we have a dual commitment as a result of that pledge, and especially being the guiding agency for housing and urban development in our country, we're committed to that. This new urban agenda, it requires actions to be implemented through public policy and projects and programs. we have to support sustainable urban development. It's a catalyst, and we think we can have a positive correlation between urban, social, environmental, and social development to create better living conditions for Ecuadorians and everybody in the region. We're also aware that we have 127 million people living in informal housing that can be 20 to 30% the population of Latin America. We're talking 6.5 times Chile's population, 7 times Ecuador's population. It's a huge challenge for these people to access public services and utilities, and especially if we think about the urban sprawl that Tatiana spoke about. So that means that there's 18,000 people moving into urban zones every single day. Ecuador, if we think about the demographics, 32% of our population is under 35 years of age. In Chile, it's 29%. And yes, there is a demographic bonus. We think it's going to be a little more sustainable, but I agree with Jose Luis that by 2050, Chile's population is going to decline and the cities are going to have to look different. We have to keep this on our radar. Demographic projections and forecasts for growth are going to shape our cities so that they are suitable for the 21st century. That demographic bonus is also a challenge, Pablo, if we think about design and construction for these new urban zones to make them sustainable. And as we're building cities, we have to make an effort to mitigate climate change. The housing improvement program for neighborhoods, these public policies, we have seen success stories, especially in sanitation and drinking water, but I don't think we've done enough. We have to make a firm pledge to coordinate various sectors together, public, private, civil society, academia, in order to create a roadmap with specific targets and actions. And alongside Minister Ward, we have proposed joining efforts to address these topics in Latin America and the Caribbean. We can work together to consolidate a true public agenda and make this development goal achievable that we so want. Finally, I think the development agenda should help us build bridges between each other. It should include opportunities for exchange like we have today, local, national, regional agreements and exchanges to achieve real development for integrated, equitable cities that are sustainable for the benefit of our countries. Thank you so much, Pablo. This meeting is happening as part of Minurbi, in which the idea is to share experiences and support each other mutually. And at the same time, to work toward building on the experiences of others in order to have common solutions. I think Same Waspa spoke about it in his presentation already, that COVID exacerbated some of the urban problems that were already underlying, such as access to housing. That's one of the crises. And in Chile, in the past 2 years, we've seen 28,000 families displaced toward informal slums, often due to fear of contagion. They were living in overcrowded situations in other homes, or they were unable to continue paying their leases. So we clearly need to confront the crisis around access to housing and access to facilities and equipment, and with an eye to the future, incorporating demographic factors and fostering public-private partnerships and including academia. We've got about 5 minutes left for our panel to wrap it up. So I wanted to give all 3 of you some time to offer your final reflections. If we think about climate change, which is clearly one of the 21st century challenges, plus the pandemic, plus local demands for greater social justice, which we saw in Ecuador, in Hong Kong, in Barcelona, and in Chile in 2019, we're kind of forgetting about one of the opportunities we have, which is digital transformation and technology, not just in terms of remote work, which we've already heard about, but also about how information is becoming increasingly accessible in real time to our citizenry and also to service providers, where it becomes possible to think about improving the provision of transportation based on data, where we see new paradigms emerging, such as the paradigm of the shared city, where you're no longer having to own a car, but you can share a car. You could share a co-working space maybe. And I want to add to that something that Samuel mentioned as well, which is these new demands, these new ways of working and inhabiting cities post-pandemic are going to have to include a great degree of flexibility in order to inject housing in areas where we have opportunities. Maybe there was a lot of office space before, or as we heard in the case of Korea, where we're seeing hotels being bought and turned into housing. That's an opportunity. How we can reinforce our neighborhoods with facilities and equipment so that we have what we call the third place. It's not work or home, but an intermediate space or an intermediate point. I think we have to be really innovative in incorporating technologies that are enabling for this sort of flexibility, which tends to happen informally, but can be a little bit complex when we're trying to plan our cities. So what do all of you think about the opportunities we have with flexibility and digital transformation and technologies, especially in emerging contexts like Latin America? Let's begin in the same order, Tatiana, then Jose Luis, and we will close with Minister Herrera. Thank you, Pablo. I'm going to speak very quickly. I know I've only got a minute. As you say, it's a great opportunity. In terms of access to information for citizens, transparency, service efficiency, digital platforms have opened up a tremendous pathway. However, they can also serve as a barrier to access. So there's two things to keep in mind here as we move ahead in terms of digital technologies. First, equitable access to technology, which is not always obvious. And two, unfortunately, as Same mentioned very quickly, we recently published guidelines on cyber safety for cities. And I think to a certain extent, our cities are not ready to face some of the challenges in poor practices. So that's another point we have to work on. And going to flexibility, as you were saying, we have new doors opening to rethink policy and planning in housing, the ability to do retrofitting, to rethink local transformations, and to rethink the standards that we need. I think we've been hearing this maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but it's becoming essential. I'm really grateful I got to participate here, and I turn over the floor to my colleagues. Thank you, Tatiana. Jose Luis, go ahead. Thank you, Pablo. So I would actually turn your question into a proposal for Minister Ward. I think we could think about setting up a laboratory to reflect on where the opportunities are. As Tatiana said, we do have an issue around cybersecurity. We need to reflect about broadband. Should that be a public good? Should it be made available to populations in our cities so everybody can be integrated into digital solutions more easily? I can give you an example that I don't think is so obvious, but we could see a tremendous opportunity. I was present at the Hydrogen Summit with Corfo and the Ministry of the Economy and Ministry of Energy and International Cooperation. How could this new phase of development serve cities? If you know that public service vehicles and even private vehicles are going to move toward becoming hydrogen-based or electric vehicles, then we got to develop that internal market to regulate the usage of hydrogen, to have mechanisms for storage and usage in our buildings, to use hydrogen in our vehicles, to think about the entire chain. We know that we have to modernize our cities. All vehicles need to be modernized and upgraded. And if I think about public transportation, it's not going to be possible or feasible, even in the biggest capitals. Think about the millions of buses in Mexico City and Brazil and Santiago. We would have to get the entire Latin American industry on board for years. We can't predict the demand. And right now what's happening is the Chinese are satisfying that demand that we're not satisfying, and we're losing chances to create know-how, to create jobs that we could have had. We're losing out on that quality growth. So I think it's kind of the same combination that Dario was talking about, growth, but with quality, minimizing externalities, and thinking about how the transitions that cities are going to face, which are unstoppable, they're coming, how they can actually contribute to growth. So Chile has a retrofitting industry for buses. And right now, it's only operating in the private transportation sector when companies are running transportation. And it could actually be satisfying the demand for this transition that we need toward electric buses. And all the cities in Chile need this. We could be fostering the transition to hydrogen to open up the market with the ministries of economy and energy who are helping in this transition. So I would set up kind of like a lab to think about these opportunities. That's excellent, Jose Luis. And we will now invite ECLAC, of course, to participate with us and everything. We're happy to have as many voices as possible. We can't work in isolated silos. We have to activate an ecosystem with all of the different ministries and agendas on board to create symbiosis, which is essential to sustainable development. Minister Herrera, the final remarks of the panel are yours. It's been a very interesting panel. Time really flew by. Thank you to all three of you. Final reflections, Mr. Herrera. Yes, thank you, Pablo. We've heard some great comments. I want to talk about something I've thought about for my whole life. You can measure to control, and then once you can control it, you can manage it. In Latin America, we all face different realities. In our situation, in Quito, we face we're seeing different realities in different cities, even within our country. Some of our cities have databases and records, some don't even have that information. For years, we've seen efforts to get a national database or registry of information set up. We've now started that project, and we hope that it will be ready by August 2023. And having information is vital. We can't make decisions without it. If we don't have data available, we can't make decisions. In the private sector, in academia, they should also have access to that information. It should be a countrywide policy for open data. We work with the Ministry of Telecommunications to try to provide this information to all stakeholders in the market so that we can make smart decisions together. Now, why is information so important? Because that's where you can spot your opportunities. And you want them to be aligned with economic growth. 81 of the more than 200 municipalities in our country, we did a survey, and the question was very simple. How many urban properties or services are not yet built? And the answer was 34%. That means the question is, why is urban sprawl continuing to grow when there are places that are unused? You've got empty lots. And so we have to analyze these opportunities, put them on the table, and generate investment and economic growth, especially foreign investment, and come up with incentives so that this terrain, these lands, these properties can be used for housing or whichever purpose. And once we have the data, we can make the right decisions. But data leads to information, leads to indicators, and that helps us make the right decisions. So I really agree with using information technology so that we can make the right decisions that are going to benefit everyone. Thank you. Excellent remarks, Dario. if you don't measure it, it doesn't exist. So yes, there are clear inefficiencies in terms of trying to make better social and economic use of the urban land we already have. Tatiana mentioned retrofitting and microdensification in consolidated neighborhoods and injecting facilities and urban equipment to make it available, especially if we think about remote work. Undoubtedly big challenges ahead, but I'm very confident that at least in Latin America, we are clear on the diagnosis. We know what the challenges are. We have to measure them, and we have to start really laying the groundwork, as Jose Luis was saying, for public policy looking ahead rather than looking back. We're always regulating what's already happened instead of looking ahead. And if we think about the 30-year term that we've set for the 2050 goal, it's a great time frame. Thank you to all three for sharing your experience and your advice and your knowledge. And I return the floor to Barbara to continue with our seminar, Cities 2050, organized in conjunction by the Ministry of Housing and Urbanism, the IDB, the National Council for Urban Development, ICLAC, UN Habitat, and the World Bank, and so many others who have participated. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. Once again, Pablo, Dario, Tatiana, Jose Luis, I agree. This has been so interesting. Time really flew by. We will continue with more content in just a bit that will be so interesting. So please bear with us. We're going to take a break now, and then we will pick it up again with our second panel at this international seminar, Cities 2050, Planning Cities from the Territories. So we'll be back in a few minutes.
Greetings from the OECD in Paris, and thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute to this very important international seminar. The OECD Division on Cities, Urban Policies, and Sustainable Development supports both national and local governments in making cities better places to work and live in by integrating various sectoral policies from all levels of government into a coherent package that targets the specific challenges and opportunities of cities. So I am very happy to hear that Chile's initiative on Cities 2050 is sharing this long-term strategic approach. And for this panel on governance and financing of cities, I will be happy to share some insights on how cities are rethinking their urban planning in the COVID-19 context and what implications this has in terms of governance and finance. So I will organize my intervention around 3 key points. First, how has the crisis affected cities? Secondly, what are the major changes in cities' urban development plans? And third, what still remains to be done? So first, how has the crisis affected cities in OECD countries? We are meeting today, of course, in a context where the prospects for global recovery are actually much better than a few months ago. And just a few weeks ago, in December 2021, the OECD has published its latest projections for global recovery. And the world economy is projected to have grown by 5.6% in 2021. And actually, in the case of Chile, GDP growth is expected to have reached even 12%. So the momentum for global recovery is very strong and it is continuing. However, an important point to note here is that this recovery is very uneven because the crisis has hit in a very asymmetrical way. So if we take here the example of the evolution of the unemployment rate since the 4th quarter of 2019, there are important variations and differences between the different countries. As you can see, the country average here on this graph in the yellow dots. But also there are major differences within those countries. As you can see, the regional variation of unemployment between the regions. And these are basically the pink rectangles on this graph. And so the differences between the regions are particularly large, for example, in Greece and Spain. We know that in most OECD regions, somewhere between 15% and 35% of jobs were at risk of disappearing due to lockdowns and restrictions related to COVID-19. But this share has actually been often higher in many cities, particularly those cities that were relying on sectors such as tourism, global trade, retail, for example. The crisis has also had a major effect on municipal finance, which even before the pandemic was already under strain in many countries. The level of fiscal decentralization at the municipal level varies across OECD countries, and Chile is actually not among the countries that were the most decentralized in this respect, as you can see on the first graph on the left here, based on data from 2017. But we also know from the underlying data that fiscal decentralization in Chile actually increased by more than 10% between 2011 and 2017. So we know that we are on a good path in this respect. At the same time, as you can see on the second graph here on the right, showing the results of a survey that the OECD has conducted jointly with the European Committee of the Regions on 300 cities and regions in 2020. The COVID-19 crisis has also had a very harsh effect on municipal finance. And this effect actually seems to increase with city size, because the larger the city, the more severe its impact is. And for example, 65% of the respondents in cities over 250,000 inhabitants have indicated that the crisis has had a highly negative impact on their city's finances. So in this context, let's now turn to how cities have changed the way they work, the way they plan their development in this COVID-19 context. The good news here is that cities have been able to shift very rapidly to practices such as teleworking, online schooling, e-commerce, or telemedicine, for example. So if I take the case of teleworking, our data estimates that, for example, in France, where the OECD is based, around 40% of jobs in France can be worked from home. But this share is much higher in Paris and the region around it, Île-de-France, where basically more than half of jobs can be worked from home, compared to only around 30% in the region of Basse-Normandie, which is a much more rural region. So cities did take a big blow from the crisis, as we just discussed earlier, but they also have a strong capacity to overcome the crisis, notably due to their level of digital equipment, for example. And throughout our work, we have observed that cities have really taken thousands of different actions, many of which are accelerating some major transitions that were already underway before the pandemic, but got a big push and got accelerated with the crisis. I will take the example of 3 transitions here, starting with a first transition in terms of the digitalization of the urban economy for a smart recovery. So all cities in OECD countries have invested one way or another in digital technologies, and some of those cities were particularly advanced and well equipped. For example, the city of Seoul in South Korea had already established a smart city data hub before the pandemic, and this kind of digital hub and infrastructure was leveraged during the pandemic to help, for example, monitor how the virus was spreading, to ensure contact tracing very quickly, for example. Many other cities in the OECD have invested in digital technologies and are mainstreaming those digital services into their daily practices to improve quality of life in the long term for their residents. A second example of a transition is, of course, the transition towards a low carbon and more circular economy in cities to shape a greener urban future. There is, of course, a strong momentum to shift towards more sustainable forms of urban mobility, for example. And we know that many cities such as Medellin, Bogota, Paris, Milan, and many, many others have built new cycling lanes, which are sometimes even called Corona lanes in many countries. And cities are also increasingly changing their consumption and production patterns, including by turning more towards, buying more fresh fruit and vegetables that is produced locally rather than produce that has been imported from further away, and many other changes towards a more sustainable urban future. And finally, a third type of transition is the transition towards a more inclusive urban society, because the pandemic has shown how unequal we are within cities, for example, in terms of our housing conditions, or how vulnerable small businesses are to the crisis compared to big multinational groups, for example. So many cities have been providing targeted support to the most vulnerable parts of their society, their population and their businesses. And so you have, for example, cities like Vienna that have built more social housing for the most vulnerable parts of their population. Cities like Frankfurt that have provided loans and consulting services to the small businesses, and many other examples. By strengthening and by combining these 3 types of transitions together in their urban development plans, cities are also building their capacity to be more resilient to other crises beyond COVID-19. And sometimes this means also that cities are revisiting and refocusing their vision for long-term development. And a few examples here just to illustrate the shift towards, for example, the concept of urban proximity, which means that cities are focusing on making goods and services more easily accessible to their residents in a radius of, let's say, 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes, as it is done in the cases of Paris, Brussels, and Melbourne here. These visions are gaining really stronger momentum in a COVID context, and they all have in common this approach of putting people back at the center of the urban plan and the urban vision. And so the urban residents are not only the users of cities, but also their co-producers in a way. This means that, of course, there is a lot of progress that has been made across cities in OECD countries, but we cannot wait to be done with the COVID-19 crisis to address many complex challenges that are still confronting cities, including the climate and biodiversity crisis, the housing crisis, inequalities, and many others. And so the magnitude of these challenges is so high that no level of government is actually able to address them alone. And in fact, almost all respondents to the joint OECD European Committee of the Regions survey on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on regional and local governments have indicated that for them, the most important policy tool in a successful exit strategy from the crisis is really coordination in the design and the implementation of measures, so coordination across all levels of government. And this means that we really need to rethink the governance and the financing of cities in a much more collaborative way. And one of the frameworks that can help cities integrate those various sectoral policy objectives into a coherent strategy is the Sustainable Development Goals, so the SDGs. And cities really have a critical role to play in achieving those SDGs. In fact, the OECD data estimates that 65% of the SDG targets will not be met without the active engagement of cities and regions and without this coordination across different levels of government. So our OECD web tool that measures the distance that still remains to be achieved to achieve those SDG targets in cities and regions show the margin for progress. And here I put the example of Santiago de Chile, where you can see in blue dots the position of Santiago vis-a-vis those SDG targets and the national average of Chile in yellow dots. So unfortunately, we did not have the data for all SDGs here, but this still gives you an idea of the progress to be achieved and how the city of Santiago can contribute to making these SDGs happen on the ground. So in a nutshell, cities were hit very hard by the crisis. The pandemic did accelerate many of the actions and the transitions that still need to happen to rethink the way we plan, that we govern, that we finance the cities of tomorrow, but there is still some way to go. And this is why at the OECD, we are providing this targeted support to specific cities and regions that make the request on how to develop, how to implement, and how to monitor those recovery and resilience strategies. So if your city and your government is interested in getting similar support from the OECD and is interested in working with us, please do not hesitate to get in touch, and we will be happy to explore options for collaboration. So thank you so much for your attention, and I wish you a very productive panel. Thank you.
Sujin Kim, thank you so much for your presentation at this international seminar, Cities 2050, Planning Cities from the Territories. We will now begin our second panel on governance and financing for integrated urban development experiences from the territories. This panel is designed to help us reflect and dialogue about the challenges in governance and funding and financing city plans, highlighting international experiences and plans and cases that have already been successful in the past and that we could replicate. So we are going to first invite our speaker, Sergio Barrisuil. He's the president of the National Council for Urban Development and the winner of the National Urbanism Prize. He's also an architect and urbanist, and he's spent much of his career in public management in Concepcion and dedicated time to teaching at several universities. So Sergio, welcome and good morning. Good morning, Barbara. It's great to be here, and thank you to everyone who organized this and to all authorities present today. We're so glad to have been invited to this discussion. So again, thank you. The challenge in talking about cities 2050 is a tremendous challenge, especially for the National Council for Urban Development. Because we think it's an extremely appealing topic, and we're so passionate about any discussion that goes beyond the political cycle of 4-year presidential mandates. That's what we're interested in, and that's what we are paying a lot of attention to in this Cities 2050 initiative. We're thankful to all of the organizers, especially to Minister Felipe Ward, who has spearheaded this initiative with the involvement of lots of national and international institutions. We're also grateful to the panel speakers and to everybody who came before us in the first block. I think they dealt with a really interesting topic, and they've really enriched the objective of this event. My role today is to offer a bit more of a national perspective. Our mission at the National Council for Urban Development is more nationally focused. We work with governance and financing, which are my topics today. But I also want to mention in broader terms, as we've heard from the different speakers in the first half, that cities are facing tremendous challenges and complex processes facing humanity from the economic and social standpoint, and add to that the challenges of climate change. So there are phenomena happening with which we're familiar. We have a lot of data about it. We have a good diagnosis, but we don't know what the future is going to look like. And that's why we are excited to think about 2050, because we all want to live in that place, which is called the future. And there are complex phenomena taking place. Perhaps they were not given due emphasis in the first half, but everything that we're facing is going to bring with it significant population displacement around the world, and cities are going to become true refuges, havens, where transformation could be unexpected, but we have to be ready for it. So having said that, when we talk about governance, or we talk about integrated urban planning, as a council, we want to contribute, and we believe it's really important. Something interesting is that in Chile, and I like to talk about the national policy for urban development. It's kind of our ethics of how cities develop. It should be orderly, and it was approved enacted in 2014. And that's a really important piece of information, because there were 14 years in the history of Chile when we didn't have any national urban development policy. And so that can make us wonder, or maybe it could even explain many of the issues we're facing now, especially some of the more negative ways that cities have evolved. Maybe it's specifically due to the absence of that policy for so long that has brought our cities to some critical points that we're going to talk about. But the policy is there, And it touches on 5 major dimensions that I think continue to really shape the biggest challenges for development in small and big metropolitan cities, especially when it comes to social integration, economic development, environmental balance. If we think about decarbonization to 2050, the 4th item is identity and heritage. And the final factor is no less important for being last. It is institutionality and governance. So the council was created to develop this policy, and it's an interesting entity because it's kind of like a small instance of governance in the discussion about the future of cities. So it's very important to understand some of the concepts that I'm going to sketch out in my presentation, and I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. There's been a generous intellectual collective contribution from the 31 members of the council who come from the academic, social, public, private sectors from all different worlds. They can have rural viewpoints, urban, multi-sectoral, about cities. And we reflect on cities and their nature and origin. As a council, we've paid attention to governance and institutionality with a very critical eye. We really have to walk the walk in this sense. So what you can see here, there's a timeline. I'm not going to go into detail on the screen, but all of these publications deal with the path to find solutions to the problems that cities are facing nowadays. And we see there will be uncertainty in the future, but governance is going to be an important factor. We can think about climate change, we can think about social integration, we can think about urban regeneration, we can think about systems in cities and how to manage institutionality and governance. This is a topic that is the focus of some documents published by the Council. So this critical viewpoint when it comes to governance also means that we are concerned about the reality of our cities and what our country is facing. We are a very urbanized country. We have a wide range of cities with different sizes and characteristics and traits, very diverse. They're very different from each other, not just in terms of their geographic and climate systems and locations, but that they're different in other ways. We have a massive deficit in housing. They've said that more than 81,000 families are not only part of the housing deficit, but are actually living in precarious conditions like slums or campsites. And in none of the cities where we've taken measurements are we able to meet all of the social integration requirements. So we have cities that right now their genetics are very segregated. The budgets across the municipalities per capita are sometimes 9 times different from each other. So if we think about governance and institutionality and resources, which are topics we're going to be speaking about, we have to think about those inequalities and inequities in governance. More than 60% of our municipalities are requiring funding from the common municipal fund. They're unable to fund themselves. We're seeing that in the regions, less than 20% of total state investment trickles down to be decided on by the regions. Only 35% of municipalities involve communities in making decisions, which is very important in governance. And only 45% of municipalities have consulted their communities about urban projects. And as a result, we shouldn't be surprised that only 43% of people are taking part in electoral processes. So that 45% of consultation being done is very much reflected in the feeling of antipathy among the citizenry and maybe a hesitancy to participate in electoral processes. So we have to talk about the dimension and the magnitude of the problem, but also the tools available to us and how we can involve communities. What I can show you here, this is unprecedented data. We're going to be launching it next week. It's going to be part of the conversation about 2050, which is to have platforms with indicators. So here you can see it's like a graphic representation of the degree of compliance with 79 indicators in 117 districts that we have surveyed from across the country. And the red shows the variables that are not in compliance with the basic requirements of a standard for urban development that has been defined for quality of life and housing. Pink means that you're close to being not in compliance. And this, you can see some interannual data as well. You've got arrows pointing up and down, showing where the cities are moving, in which direction they're moving. So you can see cities that are sometimes deteriorating year on year. On the left, you can see a city on component 8, citizen participation. In Antofagasta in particular, the indicators are not just bad, they're not just not meeting the standard, they're getting worse than they were in years prior. And in other cases, if you look on the right-hand side, in Valdivia, we've got some good performance in terms of access to services and equipment, but we can see some signs of environmental deterioration in indicator 3, where we can see clear signs of warning and alert that we can see the negative trend. So this gives us a snapshot, and we call this our city reports. They're going to be available starting next week for the Chilean cities that we've surveyed, and we think they're going to be a really great contribution for all cities and for mayors as well, for everyone to see how their city is evolving and where they should put their attention and their focus to remedy and strengthen the issues and focus on the virtues that they do have. We are, of course, concerned about those red indicators, and we're especially concerned where we see downward pointing arrows and significant deterioration. Now we can see a map at the city level as well. We've spoken about having a lot of data, and it's important to think about how to represent that data visually. It's not that we've just got a housing deficit, we've also got city deficits in Chile. We've got 13 metropolitan areas that we've pointed out, and we are developing information to find those zones that are really coming up short on the standards for accessing public goods and services. So in Santiago, you can see the intense red is showing those cities where there's really strong deficits to basic services, can be things like health and basic services, utilities, and they're also vulnerable households where you've got the most marginalized people in your society living, and where society is essentially becoming an obstacle to access improvement and the continuous improvement we're looking for. So as a council, we believe that governance and institutionality, which is what you can see on my diagram here, basically we have a proposal with 5 main points. First, you have to have a vision. You have to have a citywide vision that includes the people living there, the citizenry, a shared vision, and it has to then turn into commitment to that project. Every city has to develop its vision, which then transforms into a plan with a long-term view. Cities can enter into a virtuous cycle in the long term beyond political mandates or immediate political goals. There has to be a strategic plan that is feasible, and in order to have that, you need governance. So we say governance has 3 components. It has to be decentralized or regionalized. It has to be multi-scalar, which means that you've got the municipalities, you've got your regional governments, and you've got the metropolitan areas, and you've got the state with its, all of the sectors available to it, and all of the stakeholders participating. And finally, it has to be diverse. And diverse means it has to match the unique traits of each territory. And we have to think about the instruments we have. They're limited right now, but we should think about multiplying those instruments, adapting them to our current realities. We have regulatory instruments for urban planning that don't necessarily match the reality we're facing. We don't have tools for carbon neutrality. We don't have integrated instruments that might allow public resources to be going into the plan. And finally, the fifth element is resources. If you don't have the resources, you can't execute a plan. So we have to organize our public resources. We have to think about a plan. We have to make them effective, and that can help governance function. Otherwise, governance can be totally useless if you don't have the resources to back it up. I think this is possible. I think you can see this in other countries where we can have a different planning culture. Chile has demonstrated that it can do transformative, profound urban change and planning. And it can do that through reconstruction. We can think about Santa Olga and some different examples of cities where having a story of reconstruction can mobilize the country, and you can have concerted actions contributing to a single effort. So here's a layout of a potential plan with all of the range of public agencies that would be involved, that could be coordinating with actions, with deadlines, and everybody's flowing into the same goal. We have to make that fundamental pivot in our cities, and that has been possible, and it can be possible, not only in reconstruction, but also in constructing cities. So we want to talk about like a place like Dichato we could think about. In just a couple of years, it turned into oceanside resort, a beautiful space with lots of qualities. And this is an example of the type of thing that we can do. So we do believe that the discussion, we have our 7 documents at the council that talk about governance and how to build out that governance in the regional level and with decentralization, with multi-scalar approach, with diversity. But beyond that, we believe that we're facing a new opportunity as part of the new constitutional discussion. As a council, we think that it hasn't served Chile or its cities, that none of the constitutions has yet to recognize the city as an entity in the constitution. We think it's been harmful to cities that there's no law recognizing the term city. We think it hasn't been good for Chile that the constitution doesn't state outright that housing is a human right, and without housing, you cannot survive. And that it should be a guaranteed fundamental right for people. Maybe somewhere else in the world, housing is not a fundamental human right. I don't know, maybe the characteristics of some other place that I'm unfamiliar with might be that way. But in Chile, at least, housing is your vehicle to survive, and therefore it is an essential cornerstone to life. And cities, as we have said, and we've proposed this to the Constitutional Committee, cities are the essential vehicle, and therefore they are a right that enables building societies in a common project. And that common project, which is the city, then turns into the vehicle for so many other objectives. So we're excited and we're hopeful that the new constitution will resolve that doubt and recognize cities as an entity that should be safeguarded by the Constitution. If we think about many of the problems we face in governance and institutionality or weaknesses in implementation, we think that there is an opportunity in the new constitution. So We are excited and confident that our Chilean cities, which are right now looking ahead to the future, and they're excited about this project Cities 2050. We know that there is that challenge. It's complicated. Big ideas can sometimes become utopias, right? But they can also become reality. And at the National Council for Urban Development, we are opting for 2050, Cities 2050, to become a reality. And we're hopeful that the multiple cities and the citizens and residents living in them have a brighter future. I'm excited I got to participate, and I also want to greet Mayor Claudio Radonich, and I want to greet Patricio Vallapin as the governor, and Claudio Castro as well, my good friends here, and Juan Manuel. I know that everyone will have a great discussion about these experiences, and I will be watching closely. Barbara, thank you for the time. Thank you, Sergio, for your presentation. We're also excited to hear about that link you're making between the work you're doing and the Constitutional Convention. As stated before, we are now going to go straight into our panel. I am going to present our moderator, who will be leading the panel on governance and financing for integrated urban planning experiences from the territories. So I will be introducing Juan Manuel Sanchez, who's the head of the Division for Planning and Regional Development from the Metropolitan Region Regional Government. He's an architect with a master's degree in urban management and design from Milan. He also served as the National Director of Planning at the Ministry of Public Works, MOP. So welcome, Juan Manuel. How are you doing? Thank you, Barbara. I'm happy to be here today, and I'm happy to share this panel with the guests. I think it's going to be so interesting. I'm going to introduce our panel members. We have Patricio Vallapin, who's the regional governor of Los Lagos region. He's a geographer with a master's degree in human settlements and environment from Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, and he served as the intendant of the Los Lagos region between 2002 and 2004. How are you doing, Governor? Thank you so much for the invitation. We're actually sitting here in sort of a church office. We're doing another activity on the island of Castro to work with our church heritage here in Castro. So I hope that my signal holds up. We are experiencing in situ heritage alongside us. We also have Claudio Radonich, who is the mayor of Punta Arenas. He has a degree in legal and social sciences from Diego Portales University, and he also became an attorney with a postgraduate degree in senior management from Adolfo Ibáñez University and served as intendant of the Magallanes region from 2013 to 2014. How are you doing, Mayor? Santiago is not all of Chile, so I'm so glad to be representing another part of Chile. Thank you. And we also have Mayor Claudio Castro, the mayor of Renca, a civil engineer from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile as well, with a degree in public management from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome, Mayor. How are you? It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this theme with all of our colleagues. So we have a tremendous panel, and Juan Manuel, the floor is now yours. Barbara, thank you so much. We've brought together so many expert authorities working to improve cities at their respective scales and levels of authority. I want to talk about some experiences that Sergio brought up, and they help us combine technical and policy aspects, which is at the basis of urbanism. Decision-making has a direct impact on our lives as citizens, not just our daily lives, but also they shape many of the opportunities we have. In Chile, citizens are governed by 3 authorities simultaneously. We have local led by mayors. It's very different to have, some cities have lots of districts, or some have just one district. And in the regions, we see mayors trying to convert more of their territory into urban area. Then we have regional, and then we have national, which controls much of the planning and money. We know that this architecture is shifting, and we know that the main goal is to improve interinstitutionality that we spoke about and accelerate the processes. We know that right now they're very bureaucratic. We want to also bring processes closer to people. And we know that if we don't do this properly, it can actually have the opposite effect that we're looking for. So in your judgment, and in virtue of the different realities that all of you represent, what should be fixed at each level? And please name a solution related to urban planning and public investment that is under your power. It's a difficult question. We know that this governor is a new role, so we would like to begin with our governor. I understand that you're right now displaced from in Puerto Montt, one of the biggest regional capitals. And then we will invite Claudio Radonich, we'll go to the south, and then we'll go back up north with Claudio Castro. So 3 to 4 minutes per response. Please be brief, and I'm going to be strict and interrupt you if you go on too long. Thank you, Juan Manuel, for this invitation, and thank you to all the organizers. It was great to hear Sergio's remarks to open the panel and to hear about interinstitutional coordination. One thing is theory, another is practice. So when you pose this question about our region, what do we have to fix? We're going to have to think about, are we going to move toward building out Puerto Varas, Puerto Montt, building out more urban areas? Some people are going to say it's a good idea or it's a bad idea to build a certain metropolitan area. And that's a question we're going to have to deal with as we're making decisions in our region. We're also trying to have a regional urban development council to help us answer those questions in our region. But I believe that if there is a problem in how cities function, it's because governance is overly fragmented or segmented, and none of the actors involved, including the district or the mayor, is able to resolve it, or even the region or the sectoral authorities like public works or housing or transportation and many others. There is no clear direction. They're not rowing in the same direction. So cities are economic, productive, social, environmental, multi-actor spaces, everything that Sergio said. So they are highly complex. And I think one of the issues is that there is no single authority giving the marching orders for everyone to get in line together. Whatever happens in the future has to be better. And I think that it would be important for the Constitution to underscore the topic of cities. That word is not in the Constitution anywhere right now. That word city is not in our current Constitution. So to the extent to which we can influence the Constitution in that direction, that's important. And as governors, we're gambling on that because we are a country of regions. We should have more decision-making autonomy, more ability to make decisions, especially around investment. And we've spoken with the President-elect, Gabriel Boric, and also with the Constitutional Convention that regions need control over their own investments and over their own rural and urban spaces. The regional governor needs that power. Obviously, with a shared vision, it has to be shared toward the municipalities and toward the competent national authorities, but investment has to be spearheaded and articulated and coordinated by the regional government in absolute coordination with the districts. That would be my first starting premise, and I hope I remained within my 4 minutes and I stuck to the rules. Thank you so much, Governor. I'm sure you will be able to continue sharing with the president-elect as you have future discussions and hopefully get to a concrete proposal. And I will talk about that after. So Mayor Radonich from Punta Arenas. We also like to say that in Santiago, we are a region. We are one of the regions in Santiago. Yeah, that's true. I think one of the problems we're facing is governance and financing, and you talked about it. Our city has a district that is like equivalent to all the size of Santiago. And the urban area is just like 40 square kilometers. And we're only allowed to regulate those 40 square kilometers, and practically the rest we're not allowed to regulate. In 2017, we spoke about some of the regulatory issues. Financing was not dealt with. There is an interregional plan, but we don't have it in Magallanes. And I think we have to think about the next generation and not the next election. I'm going to be quotable. If you think about our municipalities law, there's an issue where nobody is really planning cities. Sometimes you make proposals, but then there can be a controller who is interpreting the regulations. So all of these aspects are influential. Sometimes in 2009 we start planning, and in 2017 we haven't gotten anywhere. So by the time you get something through the system, your priorities might change. So I'm going to be really clear. What can we do so that the model can be more effective? It's not effective right now. Right now, I have the same margin maybe that the mayor of Renca has, and whatever change that happens to me is going to affect the territory next to me. I have a territory that I basically can't manage, even though the law says I'm supposed to manage it. But I'm reliant on my governor, who also is relying on the interregional plan. And some of these regulations are not enforceable. Concretely, we need more consistent regulations. We've got all of these different agencies working against each other. There can be frustration, and we all say planning is important. But the regulators only make changes maybe 15 or 20 years, every 15 or 20 years, but whatever happened 10 years ago is now obsolete. And in our case, we are unable to regulate the rural land where we're facing big issues. We don't have effective instruments to do the regulation we need. And worse than that is that we're depending on third parties. We can't necessarily act autonomously. Another issue we're facing is green hydrogen, that makes all in the news all the time. Everybody talks about green hydrogen, but it's something we're not allowed to regulate. It's not under our auspices. We've asked to be able to regulate it, but the institutionality is not serving our interest right now, and I think it makes a big difference in good public policy. I agree with the governor. At a certain point in time, we just have to get down to business and have good planning, because a well-planned city is also going to be good for its neighbors. It's not only good for the architects. And when you have to try to think about a street that you have to build sewage or something there, you have to deal with what's already there. It's much more expensive to change something afterward than to do it correctly in the first place. So I do think decentralization is important, and the amount of time it takes to process a decision should be shorter. Like we see in the administrative laws, these processes can take eternity. We are also seeing overlap that among different authorities. It can lead to delays. And as soon as the instrument is ready, then sometimes you have to think about changing it. And we're seeing that we have a really bad regulatory plan down here in Punta Arenas, and we still can't do anything about it. Thank you, Mayor Radoneth. So I would like to invite Mayor Castro. I think in terms of proportion, you have practically the same population, but you're in a totally diverse territory. So you've got 52 districts that can bring benefits, but it can also bring difficulties in interinstitutional coordination at the subterritorial level. I know that you've seen a lot of investment. So what is the vision on the ground in practice about what is happening in Renca, and what opportunities do you see for that figure of the regional governor, or maybe a transfer of power or a way to resolve the scale? I want to throw a few more remarks in. So if we think about the levels, we have not just the region and district, we also have city. So we have 34 districts, for example, and we need governance that we don't have right now to make decisions for those 34 districts. I think what Sergio was saying is really interesting. If we think about the viewpoint of Renca, we have active participation in planning our city. In the past 4 years, we've tried every planning instrument possible and even more in Renca, and we've actively sought out participation. But when you think about the district level, it could even feel a little bit too big for an individual, because individuals know what's happening in their neighborhood, in their community, on their street. So I would even propose in our district plan for 4 years to even bring planning down to the neighborhood level so that participation can be much more community intensive. So when we're thinking about our regulatory plans, if we think about the size compared to what Claudio has in Punta Arenas, most of our areas are not the size of Santiago or the density of Santiago. But another complication has to do with the relationship between urban governance and the vertical levels of the state, but also the horizontal levels of the state. So if you think about housing and transportation and urban development, how are you going to get them to coordinate each other? That's really hard. And add to that the public enterprises involved, especially in the case of the metro. So coordinating all of these actors is very complex. And that translates into inequality in different treatment for people depending on where they live. We know Americo Vespucio is one example in the metropolitan region that was only built with a certain quality in certain districts and different quality in different districts. And that translates into a situation that is reflected in expenditure. I think there's a lot of changes in governance that are coming with the new constitution, and there's very hopeful changes coming. But I think we have to really accelerate these changes, and we can't have a situation where only 20% of resources trickle down to the local level. And, we're dividing it among that pot among all of our districts. In my standpoint, it's very similar to what Governor Vallespín said, although a little bit different. Yes, the regional governor should have power over investment, but I would decentralize it even further. And given that governance takes time, I think right now it depends on the political will. So I want to make a call. As long as we don't have governance to have that effective decentralization, we have to rely on our political will, as much will as possible. So when we're talking about projects that have an influence on a district, like the metro train coming to Renca, these are regional projects. They're also sectoral projects, and they must be coordinated with the district level. And it should be binding coordination. It should be influential coordination with the involvement of the community. And a final aspect that I think is interesting, it could even be controversial, the attributions, the way power is distributed. I think there are criteria that need to be protected from the constitutional, central, and regional level because they're violated at the local level. So a district, for example, should have power over its planning, but that shouldn't mean that one district can prevent integration with other districts. There are certain values that need to be protected across the board when any scale in the power structure attempts to violate them. Those were really powerful remarks, a really powerful argument to hear from the three experts on our panel. If we think about territorial differences and the concerns emanating from the citizenry that need to be resolved by authorities, it becomes necessary to think about the structure of financing cities. From another standpoint, we've seen very little change since the early days of the Republic. In fact, year after year, we're seeing discussions in the Parliament that the budget is being done by sector without a territorial vision, and it can be hard to get an integrated overview of investment when we have plans and programs at the territorial level, at the regional level, at the district level. So it can therefore be hard to evaluate whether those investments are working off each other, are synchronized, and could actually sum up to more than their parts. I want to give you an example that we recently chose. We have a new president, a new government, inaugurated March 11th, 2022. So I want to ask all of you, going to really turn the screw, what proposals would you ask for from the new government to improve city financing? So I'm not sure if the governor is still there. You just came back. So I would like to begin with you. I know you have some connection difficulties, so please go ahead. I had to wear a mask because I was among the members of the community, but I was listening. When you listen to Claudio and Mayor Radonich, I think my remarks from the beginning make even more sense. If we don't have a shared vision, if we don't have common objectives, if we don't have coherent instruments, if we don't have guaranteed financing, that's why it's so important for the city to be mentioned in the new constitution. We need those concrete actions, otherwise it's going to be so hard to make this work. When we reflect on how we can make the most progress, I want to throw my 2 cents in additionally. As a regional governor, I think we can play a role. Sorry, I think I'm going to insist again, but in our region, we are subordinated to, example, for sanitation or health rules that are determining what we can do to grow. We're having difficulties in Puerto Montt. We also want to have a 2050 vision. We want to take part in that initiative. But right now, we are unable to do so due to restrictions from the Minister of Public Works or Housing, where we have constraints on the degree to which we're allowed to extend the infrastructure needed for urban development. So once again, a governance issue. And if you've got a company that's 51% private, they can't be deciding how cities are going to grow. We need the regional governments to be involved in that. And as you said, the president-elect, Gabriel Boric, one of his big demands was to say, don't transfer powers without consultation. At this point, they've transferred 15 competencies to us, and we haven't even been consulted about how useful they are or how helpful they are. And maybe other types of powers that we really would like to have haven't been transferred. And we've talked about this with the president-elect. We need to agree on that in advance so that we don't have the wrong authorities deciding to what extent our cities can grow and how they can grow. Because we need the infrastructure in place. So these are topics that we have to keep in mind. When you're defining the new rates that are going to be charged by sanitation companies, this has to be taken into account in city growth. For this to function, we need the coordination in place, and that has to take place before we can advance in certain pillars of development. Thank you, Governor. We are running out of time, so I'm going to invite Claudio Radanich to speak. There's a topic in Chile, like good Latin American countries, we love to regulate everything. We love to put rules on everything. And then we heard the word political will. If I ask the public services in Magallanes, what are you dreaming of for the next 50 years? And I compare it, I'm going to have my answer for planning. So we invite all of the services to tell us what they're thinking, not what they're already doing, what they're hoping for. Sometimes you can see contradictions come up. So when you're planning, you can see, okay, maybe a sidewalk broke because there's a water issue and you want to make sure that it won't happen again. Those are daily things that happen. The topic is how we decide what's important and what matters to us. If we go out to the street, for example, and we talk about urban planning, I'm not sure people would call it a priority. And I remember I was just, we were talking about citizen participation with a regulatory body, and it's important that you have participation from the public and the private, and that they understand the importance of urbanism. So before we come up with rule after rule after rule, I would say that it's important to note that this topic matters for the state, and we need to have flexibility and the time and the pot of money that allows us to have a regulatory plan every couple of years that doesn't rely on exogenous conditions. If you plan well, you will spend money on it, and the sanitation companies are essential. They play a role, but they can be seen as private, so sometimes they're left out. And they're essential, especially in districts like we have. So I think about the need to regulate certain things that we're unable to regulate right now as a municipality. So second, we want to reduce the amount of time for processes to take place. And of course, as I said, Santiago is not the same as Chile, and Alerce, Puerto Varas, Puerto Montt are all going to play a different role than we're going to take place. We're 40 square kilometers in 17,000. So if we don't have the tools, then at the end of the day, we're just going to be running in circles as we are right now. Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Castro, your formal requests for the new government? Going back to financing, I would propose that we talk about subnational expenditure. A lot of times we think only about distribution, and we think that the magic wand is to just change how we distribute the common municipal fund. But what we have to do is actually change the logic of financing. So 20% of public spending is defined subnationally in Chile. In the OECD, it's actually 60% as an average. That's what we have to move toward. Increase the amount of spending. It's not a matter of distribution, but increasing the percentage that is at the local or regional level rather than the national level. And I think also at the municipal level, it's important to define per capita spending. As municipalities, we have roles that we have to play, picking up waste, maintaining public spaces, green spaces, etc. And most of the municipalities in the country are unable to complete those minimum roles. And as we heard from Governor Vallespín, the Congress sometimes tosses more responsibilities on us without giving us the resources to carry out those competencies. So defining per capita amounts, which can of course be corrected later on depending on the characteristics of each municipality, but per capita should be a factor taken into the financing calculation. And finally, going back to governance rather than just administrative issues, would be to tie a central and regional investment to district level participation. I think it's really important that the government can promote public-private partnerships as well to amplify the impact of investment. Public investment can trigger private investment. We can do a lot more at the municipal, regional, and local level to amplify investment with an eye to equity as well. Thank you so much, Mayor. So we are reaching the end of this panel, Barbara, but I would like to give one final minute to each of our speakers. And I would like to go back to what Mayor Castro said. When we're doing economic construction, is there space to use public-private partnerships? And what would be the path to do so in an equitable fashion? Please take 1 minute. What options do we have on the table to amplify our resources to finance our cities? Let's begin with Mayor Castro. And we'll go in reverse order to end our conversation. I think there's a lot of initiatives in our country that we could implement. Construction, of course, has a role to play. And the possibility of public enterprises being involved. I think there's a really interesting gamble on infrastructure, promoting that type of investment. But this can also be done at the regional and district level, amplifying the pot of resources available. And we also have to think about resources at the local level. There are a lot of tax exemptions available that actually sometimes exacerbate inequality. More than 90% of housing can be exempt from paying taxes, and the wealthiest people are living in the wealthiest sectors with the most expensive housing, of course. So we need to take that approach with an eye to equity and equality. And I firmly believe that construction, especially urban construction, is an essential lever for equality. That's the order of the day in Chile right now, and I think that's the viewpoint to long-term planning. Thank you, Juan Manuel, and thank you to the other participants. Thank you to you, Mayor, for your remarks, and thank you for your interesting arguments. Mayor Radonich, is there space for public-private partnerships? Please turn on your microphone. I don't think the state needs to have its hands in everything to fix everything and have, the state has to do every single thing. But there should be rules that are flexible. And what we're seeing right now is we need governance. That's our principal bottleneck. And state financing is very important. And there's a very natural development from that. Decentralization can't be done just halfway. I always say Santiago is not Chile, but Punta Arenas is not Magallanes either. And you should bring power closer to people. So if you think about, be careful with that word. You have to bring the power down to the territories, and you have to be flexible. Decentralization can serve as a way to find solutions, because right now there's 99% of my territory where I'm not allowed to plan, and I'm relying on third parties. And that 1% under my power, where most of our people live, even where the law tells me that I can do regulations, I have to then send them to 3 agencies that take 7 years to check what I'm sending. It takes too long. Living in cities is very complex. I think we have a common viewpoint, and I want to thank Minister Ward, who I see is here. To emerge from poverty, this is essential work in Magallanes. but we need to do it in a regional framework. We're all different, but it can be done within that framework. And I think the work that has been done this year is really valuable. We're very grateful, and we've seen progress made on every front. Thank you, Mayor Radanich. Now, Governor Vallestin. I want to be clear that we are no monster at the regional government. I want to respond. But historically, the issue has been centralism. Let's be clear on our viewpoints and not be mistaken. Subnational governments are the regions and districts, and both have the maximum decision-making power and resources in their role. So I'm not here to interfere with anyone else. And as the regional government, I don't think we should be involved in the district regulatory plans. That's your area. You're chosen by your people. And of course, it should just be coherent with the other plans. So we want to be a partner to you, but with a decentralized viewpoint. And in terms of public-private partnerships, it's not just that there's space for it, it's that it's essential. If you create that kind of space with an eye to public policy from the authorities at the district or region and national level, you can resolve it. And you can also have guaranteed financing. And I think it's really important that some taxes that right now are only paid into the national level and then are distributed later on to the region, I think it would be better for them to be paid directly into the local or regional level from the start, so they're available to those levels. As I said, as the region, we are not the enemy. We think that the only enemy to confront is the central level. I think you're aware of that, Mayor Radanich, so let's not be mistaken in our viewpoint. Thank you, Governor, and thank you, Mayor Radanich and Mayor Castro, for your remarks. As you can see, this is an ongoing discussion. It's been really enriching to hear your different viewpoints. We are building institutionality, we are building governability, and that is the reason why we believe that long-term planning anchored into the future can bring us to where we want to be. It can be a good way to become the society we want to be. And we think this type of seminar, Minister, can serve that type of purpose. Thank you, Barbara, and I return the floor to you. Thank you. Thank you, Juan Manuel. Thank you to the governor and the mayors. We can see that there are a lot of topics still on the table to debate and that are still developing. Please bear with us for a few more minutes. We're going to take a break again and then come back with our final block. We will speak to the architect, Alfonso Vergara, about policies and planning how to sustain agreements and visions for cities in the long term. We'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you for waiting during the break. We're back for the final panel. We're going to have a really interesting and exciting discussion, a new look at all of the content we've had this morning. So this panel is policy versus planning. How can we sustain agreements and visions for cities in the long term? So the aim of this discussion is to bring together all of the content from the previous panels and underscore the relevance of cities in the national and international context. And of course, recognize the importance of the urban agenda and the development plan, all with the long-term vision. I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Alfonso Vegarra from the Metrópoli Foundation. He's an architect, economist, and a sociologist. He also has a PhD in urban and regional planning, and throughout his career, he has highlighted the importance of cities and their major role in addressing economic and social challenges predicated on smart territories. How all of these aspects combine is what we're going to hear about from our speaker. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Good morning. It's a pleasure to have heard the previous panels. It's really incredible to have such a deep dive in this moment in Chile's history. Alfonso, our challenge is to kind of tie up all of the loose ends from this morning's discussion and talk about long-term planning. It can be very difficult when you have authorities that are only in power for a certain time period and have a political agenda. And it can be hard to think about the long term. What do you think of that challenge? How has it been evolving? And what role do dramatic factors like the pandemic play? What opportunities and challenges do we have? The key, in my view, is to really understand what planning means for our societies. For example, in Europe, there's been a lot of effort around planning at the regional scale and the intermediate scale and the municipal scale. But there's never really been long-term planning that has been successful. There's a government team that comes into power. Obviously, they want to impose their own vision and their own objectives. And I think it's essential to maybe rename planning. Maybe we could think of it as a shared vision of our territory of the future at the regional and local scale, and of course at the national scale too. I think that vision is essential. Having a broad, flexible, strategic vision, and of course identifying the projects and strategies, the concrete projects and strategies that we can commit to executing in a reasonable time frame. So striking that balance between strategic, overarching, holistic vision, and at the same time identifying territorial projects, strategic, concrete projects that are going to have an impact and a transformative impact that can be both a hard and soft way to get at the topic rather than doing it only through traditional tools, which can be overly rigid. And it's very hard to adapt them. It can take a long time. When it's time to make changes, it needs to be possible to make those changes. And in some cultural environments, they call it like beyond planning, doing it at different levels and different scales, involving a strategic vision. And I think that can really shape our outlook. And it can include leadership at the local, regional, national level to have collective projects for the future. So it has become clear that one of the deficits in planning, as we are thinking about it for the future, is that something that we talked about at the beginning of the seminar, how there's imbalances and inequalities in cities that have emerged, especially with the pandemic, and how poorly planned our cities were. What can you tell us about that? Once the problem becomes visible, maybe it's easier to address. Cities are essential to countries. If a country can have a well-organized and well-articulated and connected system of cities with complementary functions, I think that country is going to be much better prepared to be economically competitive at the global level and to deal with much of the challenges facing humanity. Many of the challenges that we're facing, climate change and poverty and social integration environmental sustainability from different standpoints, many of these questions can be dealt with at the scale of cities by working at the city level. What happens is that many countries don't necessarily have a match between the amount of authority that these territorial level might have and the budget or capacity or political power that is actually in place. So I think that cities are engines of the economy. They are a place where you can work towards social integration, and you can also work toward environmental sustainability and address climate change. And we need more power and more confidence in our cities and their regional environments. We were just talking about governance. It seems that there's still some disagreement. We don't yet have broad consensus on how to implement it, but we know we need it. So what role would you apply to each level? What role would you assign? And it's good to hear an outside perspective because we're at a point in time where we are in a constitutional process redefining all the rules. I think this project, Cities 2050, is a pioneering, cutting-edge project in Latin America and in the whole world. Urbanism is a topic that often gets pushed aside. A lot of countries just focus on competitiveness at any cost, and maybe they just have sectoral policies, and they're not really interested in cities and territories. So the fact that at this point in Chile's history, that there's a cities program with a vision to 2050, with a new commitment to organizing the way that different levels of the government interact with each other, and especially with an eye to public and private partnerships, I think it's a massive contribution. I've spoken with Maimuna, the executive director of a UN Habitat, and she was telling me that she spoke to Minister Felipe Ward about these topics, and she's really excited about what's going on. And she wants to share the Chilean experience with other countries that she's visiting in the world. So we can sometimes be overly critical toward ourselves, but I do want to share with you from the outside that it's essential for governments to really emphasize cities. Another country that we have a good relationship with is Colombia, and their Ministry of Housing is now called the Ministry of Cities, right? So you can start to see some steps forward in that direction. If cities function well, the country runs better. So I think it's an interesting and exciting challenge to get to work on the system of cities. So yeah, on 2 points that you mentioned, we don't only have a housing deficit, we have a city deficit. Maybe we need to change the way we're thinking and think much broader beyond just housing. And I also want to touch on the importance of including other factors like climate change and caring for the environment, and how we can take advantage of all of these factors and work in a more holistic fashion. Yes, that's what I think is really key. There's a big difference between some cities and others, some territories and others. There are some territories that are really complex, have a lot of population, some are smaller, some are in very developed countries, others are in emerging nations. There's very diverse territories, but there's one fundamental thing I can say. There are territories that have a project that have been able, through leadership, whether it's political or social leadership, they've been able to define a project with consensus. And there are territories that don't have a project. And if you're a territory that you don't have a project toward the future, it's very hard to become magnetic and attract activities and investment and talent and initiatives and be aligned with any sort of vision. So a very intrinsic value that the public sector can contribute to territories is helping them to form a project for the future. It's a really important task. And Maimuna as well, we had a meeting years ago about this topic, and she said, when I visit cities and leaders from around the world, I realize that many of them are unable to even think about 1 billion in investment because they're not even able to deal with 1 million in seed capital. So it's so important to think about the city as a project to make things happen, to combine all the levels of administration, for the private sector to be involved too, and to act in the collective interest. Let's think about the case of Chile. We have some cities that are highly populated, others that are not. If we think about the pandemic as hopefully the glass being half full, we've seen the inequality revealed. Not everybody can get to work. The people who live in the farthest away neighborhoods still have to move around. They can't necessarily access remote work. What can we do in the face of that reality? Not just thinking about decentralized powers, what can we do in people's daily lives in their cities? I think the pandemic has taught us a lot, and this has been said frequently. It has accelerated the need for change. For example, we've realized some of the limitations of our housing that maybe needs to be redesigned for families that want to work from home, some type of hybrid housing where you can live and work at the same place. Or if we think about universities, maybe the universities of the future are going to have an in-person portion, but they may have increasingly the possibility to connect to professors from around the world and have an online teaching component. Or our malls, our shopping centers, electronic commerce, online shopping is going to reinvent the role of malls. It's not just about going out in person and buying a product. It's about maybe having an experience, a purchase experience, and mobility, of course. The rise in e-commerce is changing the footprint of mobility in our cities. Logistics, that last mile logistics, which we didn't have in place before, is so important now. So in urban hubs, we have to be able to live, work, shop, learn. So we're seeing all of these functions that have to be reinvented. We just have to reinvent cities. And above all, we have to understand that we have to go from cities seen as isolated communities to cities seen as interconnected communities. And in that sense, I think Chile has a ton of potential in its system of cities. Chile doesn't have a massive population, but it has a spectacularly long territory and access to the Pacific and a shining economy. It has enormous potential. But more than half of the population in Chile is concentrated in the central region, what we call the center diamond of Chile. Santiago and its metropolitan area, but also Valparaiso and San Antonio. And we have the potential for extraordinary complementarities between that center area and other areas. We know that 50% of the population of Chile is living there, and it's the motor of the economy in Chile. But if it can coordinate well in terms of mobility and complementarities and nature protection and the access to the sea and mountains, if we can include cities of all different sizes, it could be a really great laboratory to experiment with urban solutions in Latin America. There's a lot of population, and it could serve as a benchmark. Some topics are easier than others. It can be maybe easier in a medium-sized city rather than a large, complex city. One of the big challenges that we're facing, which is not just competitiveness or care for the environment, we're also facing territorial solidarity and social consciousness. I think this was mentioned in the previous panel. Urbanism and city design can contribute in large part to territorial solidarity. The wealthy and the poor, the residents and the visitors, the people who live there and the tourists, the public space belongs to all of us. To the extent that we can have common spaces and equipment and facility available, then we're doing an extremely powerful form of redistribution. It's an enormous task ahead, but there's a big role for the municipalities to play in the regional government in shaping the future of Chile. So how difficult is that if you say, we have to reinvent everything? We've seen in practice that some people are used to living maybe in a certain place. Maybe it doesn't even have the basic requirements, or it could be hazardous, and they don't want to leave where they're living. how can we create the cultural change we need to go along with all of the technical side and the organization and long-term planning? It's about pushing it in the right direction. You can't go from one day to the next, right? Practically all the territories that have had success and that we admire around the world, practically all of them have had long-term policies. I don't know any city that's been successful without having a long-term vision, a vision that goes beyond the next round of elections. Even the mayors with long-term visions, they have to think beyond the next election rounds, the next round of legislation. As long as the constitutions permit it, then sometimes mayors are even in power for multiple mandates, and they can really gain the confidence of the people they work for. But it's an extremely interesting task. Chile is facing a new constitution, the possibility to introduce the city as a basic unit of articulation in the country. And it's a very urbanized country, like Chile, where, as we've seen, a huge portion lives in cities. And I think it can serve as an inspiration for how to build and design these cities of the future. And even if the national government or the state can provide resources to develop urban projects, we also have to trust the private sector. If we are going to work collectively with consensus toward the future, we can inspire the private sector to invest in projects that are in the collective interest rather than everybody doing their own thing. So public-private partnerships, if it's done well, with confidence, with respect, with awareness, it can be done in a transformative fashion. In Spain, since the pandemic came, we've actually done some exercises around planning from the start with the support of the private sector. We're not just funding research, we're asking for a commitment to invest in the projects that are going to emerge from these processes with participation. The private sector does have a role to play in those public-private partnerships, but what about economic growth or other activities that is not directly tied to cities, but we still need it to happen? How can we harmonize it with our cities? How can we harmonize with industries that are producing negative externalities? The key is that urbanism shouldn't be considered only the physical organization of the territory. And we also have to think about economic clusters, the social and economic profile of each city, and it can arise from participation. Participatory processes are very important, but it's also essential to be creative and innovative. So it's important to have a participatory process and have a participatory methodology involved in the strategic reflection, but you also need that creative experimental drive to make the process valuable. I think with that combination of creativity and innovation, and on the other hand, participation, then you can coordinate that collective project to which we aspire. And in that vision of a city, as you said, it's so essential to think about the economic profile. Not all economic activities can be developed in every part of the territory. If one area has an advantage, then it should be done there. It could be mining or agriculture or industry or health or education. So it's very important to arrive to a consensus on what each city is going to go for. Not every city has to do the same thing. Not every city has to have the same scheme or plan. As we've heard from our panel members, the identity and singularity and the differential profile of each city is unique. And there is no one-size-fits-all solution. If you have a solution that works in another place, you can't directly rubber stamp it onto another. So you need that vision of the future, but you also have to think about what economic clusters are going to be the ones you go for. It's really essential to coordination. For example, maybe education. If you want to go for universities, or you want to go for energy, or you want to go for infrastructure, it has to really be tied to the economic clusters present in each city. I think it's a really interesting topic. And you also mentioned something in your comment that I really wanted to bring up. some economic activities produce externalities. And in the concrete case of Chile, where you have incredible mining wealth, everybody's envious of it, but in some regions, mining development can destroy landscapes and produce an impact on communities and on certain populations and on nature. So there is a challenge there as well in that city's 2050 philosophy, a challenge to lay out eco-development strategies where you include landscape, you include coastline, you include the fact that there's mining, that there's infrastructure built with purpose, and that you just try to strike a balance. The country needs that wealth for development, but at the same time, we need to preserve the territory for future generations. Alfonso, another final topic that I want to bring up, it's a little bit harder to make progress on, but many speakers have mentioned it today, social integration. How do we make progress on social integration? It's so important to quality of life and coexistence, but it can also be the hardest work to do or the slowest work. That's true. Just as we've seen in other decades, urbanism has really emphasized competitiveness of territories, right, on strategic visions. At other points, sometimes we see the emphasis on sustainability or on getting technology into cities. But nowadays, I think there's a lot of consensus that the big challenge is social integration. No city that has inequality or is imbalanced is going to do well. You're going to have social conflicts, you're going to have insecurity, you're going to have situations that are unexpected. So solidarity at every level is an important challenge. And I think probably never before in the history of cities has there been greater consensus than there is now with our sustainable development goals. There's enormous consensus at the international organization level, the national government, the region level, the city level, the company level, the academia, citizens in general. There's a lot of consensus across this. But practical application of our sustainable development goals is not something that is getting necessarily the same energy with which everybody embraces the objectives. So I think we're standing before an extraordinary opportunity for Chile to really implement this with the Cities 2050 program and do some pilots and be an international benchmark of how to integrate these sustainable development goals into our reality. So to close, I would ask for your reflections, expectations about what we can achieve with Cities 2050. Many countries and regions are becoming, they're seeing cities become paralyzed due to insufficient planning tools. Planning can be overly rigid. It can take a long time to create plans or develop plans or change plans when it's necessary, but the reality is changing so quickly. So there's a mismatch. And that mismatch is putting the brakes on the energy that our political leaders have to implement solutions in the territories. It's hindering the capacity of the private sector to dialogue with the public sector. So I think it's not necessarily about inventing new regulations, but let's make them more flexible. And let's focus on maybe non-binding documents where we can express the collective will, the collective vision for the future, and at the same time, we'll be able to have consensus around the strategic projects we want to go for. And if something really wants to get done, we'll be able to make the regulatory changes necessary to get that project done. But we shouldn't be obsessed with, a 20-year rigid plan because changes are going to happen very quickly. So more flexible planning and more participatory planning can be enormously useful to transform the country at many levels. Thank you so much, Alfonso, for that conversation. Have a great day. Thank you for participating. Thank you. We will now return the floor to our Minister of Housing and Urbanism, Felipe Ward. We invite him to offer closing remarks. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you to everyone who has participated, to our speakers. Thank you to Alfonso for those final remarks. Thank you to Maimuna, the Executive Director of UN Habitat, and thank you to everyone who contributed these inputs, which are so valuable. I want to thank Valentina Gonzalez, our Communications Director at the Ministry of Housing, Felipe Arteaga, Director of the Center for Studies, and their teams. Cities 2050 should become a bridge because many good policies and good programs are born and die with administration cycles, and Cities 2050 is meant to be a bridge into the future to create continuity. Cities operate on a timescale that is different from the political timescale, and we hope that this initiative will transcend the end of our administration and become an initiative that will help us coordinate from the territories and from cities what happens in the future. We think that when decisions are made from the territories, from the districts, from the regions, in Chile's case, the chance that we'll make a mistake is less. And when you have cities play a major role, that's the genesis of Cities 2050. I'm really thankful to the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the OECD, all of the institutions that have taken part, ECLAC, of course, to everyone who has helped create and push forward this initiative. I also want to thank Emil TV and Barbara for joining us. We hope that you've enjoyed the conversation. I have a lot of tasks ahead. I've heard so much great input from all of you. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I think if there's one point about which there's a lot of consensus is that these policies must be long-term. So let's take that home with us. We are coming to the end of this international seminar, Cities 2050, Planning Cities from the Territories. We especially want to thank our Minister of Housing and Urbanism, Felipe Ward, who just offered our closing remarks, and our international experts and national experts and speakers and moderators and panel members who took part in our broadcast from Emo TV today. Thank you to everyone, and we invite you to keep up with upcoming initiatives from Cities 2050. Have a great day.